we introduce Ms. Pianalto, mark your calendars for the next event of the Professional Advisor Council and the Akron Community Foundation, which we will bring your way in the week of June the 8th. And Carol Weissman will be a keynote speaker, and she's the author of a book entitled Raising Charitable Children. The presentation and the event will be hosted by David and Cheryl Vernage. And then in September, the Council and the Foundation will bring for you a gently different speaker, a sales coach for professional advisors. Not that anybody here needs any sales coaching, Dave. All right. Don't forget that the Foundation also brings you educational materials. I think everybody's seen these brochures. If you haven't, or if you need another one, they're at the table in the back. We've also are in the process of developing a series of educational sessions. And last but not least, if you haven't been to the Akron Community Foundation's website lately and clicked on the tab for advisors, take a few minutes, get through it. The amount of additional information for you as you work with your clients, it's just spectacular. So take a few minutes and make sure you're up to speed on all of that. So let's learn a little bit about Sandra Pianalto before we learn about the direction of interest rates here in 2015. Ms. Pianalto is the American success story. She was born in Italy and at 5 years old moved here with her family. She went to St. V's and after that earned a bachelor's degree in economics here in our own backyard from the University of Akron, and then pursued and completed a Master's of Arts in Economics from George Washington University. Subsequent to her formal education here at home and in our nation's capital, she was appointed an economist at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., and served on the staff of the Budget Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. In 1983, when interest rates were at or near their peak, Ms. Pianalto joined the Federal Reserve Bank to do something about it. She was clearly successful, as rates have been on the decline ever since. That first assignment at the Fed was as an economist in the research department, and she was subsequently appointed Assistant Vice President of Public Affairs in 1984, Vice President and Secretary of the Board of Directors in 1988, First Vice President and Chief Operating Officer in 93, and President in 2003. She served as the President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland for over 10 years, from February of 2003 through May of 2014. During her tenure, Ms. Pianalto had both local and national leadership responsibilities. As you might expect, she participated in the formulation of U.S. monetary policy, and in addition, as a leader, she was responsible for more than 1,000 Fed employees in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh conducting economic research, supervising financial institutions, and providing payment services to commercial banks and the U.S. government. Since her recent retirement from the Federal Reserve Bank, Ms. Pianalto serves on the board of directors of Eaton Corporation, the J.M. Smucker Company, and is vice chair of the board of directors of University Hospitals. She is also an advisory trustee and an executive in residence for the University of Akron. She holds a number of honorary degrees from the University of Akron, Baldwin-Wallace College, Cleveland State, John Carroll, Kent State, Notre Dame College, Ursuline College, and the University of Toledo. How about a warm welcome for Sandra Pianalto?
Thank you very much, Mike, for that very nice introduction. Until Mike pointed out that I joined the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland when interest rates were at their peak, I left, as Mike implied, when interest rates are at their historic low. Back in 1983, as Mike pointed out, rates were high. But when I left, the federal funds rate, which I'll be talking about tonight, was at 0 and is still at 0. So there's some good news and bad news in all of that. But I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. I see many friends and acquaintances, people I've met over the years here in Northeast Ohio, so it's very nice of you to join us. And I also want to add my thanks to Mike's for the support and contributions you're making to the Akron Community Foundation. It's a wonderful organization that supports many very important and critical initiatives here in the Akron community. So I thank you for your support of the Akron Community Foundation. It is making our community a much better place. Tonight I was asked, as Mike pointed out, to comment on what to expect from the Federal Reserve in 2015. And one thing that we do expect, that I expect, most of you have heard about, is that the Federal Reserve plans to raise interest rates in 2015. When exactly they plan to do that isn't known with any certainty. Even the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the group that's making these decisions, doesn't know for sure when they're going to raise rates. Their next meeting is on March 17th and 18th, and so the afternoon of March 18th, I am confident that we're going to get some very important information from that group. But it is, that question has been getting a lot of attention because we've had interest rates, the one that the Federal Reserve targets, called the federal funds rate, essentially at 0 since the end of 2008. So it's been more than 9 years since the Fed has raised rates. It's always difficult to know the timing of an interest rate increase, but I can assure you this time is going to be one of the most difficult times for making that decision because we are in uncharted waters. The committee that sets those interest rates is dealing with experience that they don't have a lot of historical precedents, a lot of historical experience to rely on. So this is going to be a very challenging decision, the timing of when to have that first rate increase. So tonight I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background on the committee decision-making process and let you assess when you think that liftoff date is going to be. I mentioned that it's even more difficult this time around for the committee to determine when to raise rates because we are and have been through some extraordinary times and still not back to a normal environment. It was in late 2008 that I mentioned the Federal Reserve took the historic step of bringing interest rates down to essentially 0, where they remain today, that short-term interest rate that the Federal Reserve targets, the federal funds rate. And at that time, the economy was on the brink of going into a second depression. And so the Federal Reserve, and I was part of the group at that time, needed to use unconventional tools to provide even more policy accommodation. We couldn't bring rates down below 0, so we needed to turn to unconventional tools to help provide more accommodation support for the U.S. economy that was on the brink of another depression. So we turned to unconventional tools. The one that got the most attention was a program called our large-scale asset purchases. The public came to know that as quantitative easing, or QE. And we launched 3 programs of QE. And what this large-scale asset purchase program was about was the Federal Reserve bought trillions of dollars worth of long-term U.S. Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities. In fact, our balance sheet grew from $900 billion to $4.5 trillion where it is today. And the purpose behind buying large amounts, large quantities of Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities was to keep downward pressure on interest rates, because so many of our interest rates build off of where the 10-year Treasury security rate is. So with these, us buying these large amounts of these securities put downward pressure on interest rates, especially mortgage rates, because we were buying, again, a huge amount of mortgage-backed securities. So this was an unconventional tool that, again, helped the Federal Reserve keep interest rates low. Lower interest rates translate into more borrowing by consumers and businesses and more economic activity. So that was the thinking behind that. Also, the purpose of keeping another side effect of keeping interest rates low is that it would push investors into riskier assets, and it was important for more risk-taking to go on in the economy, again, to bring us back to a more normal environment. Another unconventional tool that the Federal Reserve used during this period of time is what we called our forward guidance, giving the public more information about how monetary policy was likely to evolve. It was actually, the forward guidance was actually introduced by Alan Greenspan back in about 2004, when the markets expected the Federal Reserve to start raising rates at that time. And instead, the committee, except back then when Alan Greenspan was chair, the statement that was released was always his statement, the chairman's statement. It's now a committee statement. But his statement often said, for a while there, said that we would keep interest rates low for a considerable period of time. That signaled to markets, again, it was giving markets some forward guidance. The Federal Reserve, during this financial crisis and during these difficult economic times, turned to using forward guidance again. And in fact, and I'm going to go through a little bit of history, and I hope it's not too much detail for you, but it just gives you an understanding. I think it'll help you understand how difficult it is to know when the right time is to raise rates. Because in August of 2011, we issued a statement after our meeting saying that economic conditions are likely to warrant exceptionally low levels of the federal funds rate, meaning we were going to keep the Fed funds rate near zero until at least mid-2013. So back in August of 2011, we thought the economy was improving enough that we could raise rates at mid-2013. Obviously, the economy did not turn out as we had forecasted, and in January of 2012, we changed that language to say that we thought interest rates should stay near zero at least through late 2014. And then in September of 2012, when the economy continued to just be sluggish, we changed that to that date to mid-2015. And so now we're getting closer to 2015. But the committee changed language again a few more times. In December of 2012, we decided that it was not a good idea to keep throwing out these dates that we were missing, and in fact throw out some information regarding the economic data that we would be looking at. What kind of economic targets were we going to be looking at to help us decide when to raise rates? And so we issued a statement saying that we would keep rates low at least till the unemployment rates reach 6.5%, and where inflation would not get above a half percentage point above our target. Our target, the Fed's target for inflation is 2%. So back in January of 2012, which is not that long ago, just a couple of years ago, the committee thought that it would take us, by the time we got the unemployment rate down to 6.5%, and we kept inflation around 2%, we could start raising interest rates. Again, that's not how economic activity evolved. The unemployment rate now is at 5.7%, well below that 6.5% target that was thrown out there back in 2012. And inflation is nowhere near 2.5%. In fact, inflation has gone below the committee's target of 2%, and inflation is very, very low at this time. So I give you that history just to tell you that it's very difficult to know and to throw out there a date or a time when interest rates should be increased because economic conditions continue to evolve. Today, in fact, for the last two meetings, the committee has used slightly different language, and it's telling the public that it can be patient in raising interest rates. So that's some background on the kind of unconventional policy tools the Federal Reserve has had to use during these very challenging times. In September of 2014, the committee issued a set of principles called their normalization principles, talking about how they tend to unwind this very large balance sheet and to bring interest rates back into more normal levels. And the first time those normalization principles, though, were issued was back in 2011, again, when I was part of the group, because, again, we thought back then we would be normalizing policy sooner. But the committee amended these principles in September of 2014, just last year, and changed, again, their thinking about how they would raise rates and how they would manage this balance sheet. But they also made it clear that even though they updated these normalization principles, they were still not ready to bring policy back to a normal environment. So monetary policy today remains highly accommodative, and the committee continues to say they're going to be looking at a wide range of economic data, including how labor markets evolve, how the inflation environment evolves, and how financial markets, developments in financial markets evolve. And in fact, in the current chairman of the Fed, Janet Yellen's press conference following the December meeting, she said that even after employment and inflation are near the mandated objectives for the committee, economic conditions may for some time warrant keeping the federal funds rate target below where the committee considers normal. And also in a statement following that meeting, the committee said that it can be patient in beginning to normalize monetary policy. And the reason this committee is emphasizing being patient or keeping interest rates lower for longer than historical experience, there's several reasons for it. And the committee has never, as a group, verbalized these reasons. But if you listen to various members, committee members' comments, speeches, or conversations, obviously, that I've been a part of, there are several reasons why this committee thinks it can be patient and doesn't want to be quick to raise interest rates. The first reason, it goes back to the fact that the committee could not lower interest rates below zero. And so there's some thinking that because for that period of time from 2008 until, again, when you get back to more normal unemployment rates and more normal inflation rates, that we couldn't bring rates below zero, that now, even when you get back to that maximum employment and stable prices, the committee needs to keep interest rates lower to make up for that time when they couldn't bring interest rates below zero. So that's one factor that the committee has been saying it can be patient. Another factor that weighs on some of the committee members' minds is that this financial crisis caused credit availability to be disrupted, and it had a huge impact on consumers. The consumers' net worth, which caused a change in consumer spending behavior and in consumer savings behaviors. And to this day, credit markets, there are still studies that show that credit, to get credit, you need to be much more credit worthy than obviously you were during the financial crisis, or prior to the financial crisis, but the credit is even tighter than it should be in normal times. And so there are some that say we need to keep interest rates lower for a longer period of time until credit markets become more functional. And then another reason that's given, and this is the one that Ben Bernanke often talks about, is that we learned some very important lessons from the Great Depression and the experience that Japan had. In both of those cases, the central bank raised rates and removed accommodation too soon. Ben Bernanke was a student of the Great Depression. He did his PhD dissertation on the Great Depression. And it took a long time for economists to fully understand that the Great Depression was caused by the Federal Reserve being too tight. And in 1937, the Federal Reserve began removing its policy accommodation and the country went into another recession. And so that lesson of having removed accommodation too soon was front and center in Ben Bernanke's mind and also other members of this committee. And I also mentioned the Japanese experience. You know, for 20 years, the Japanese central bank kept providing accommodation, and then once their inflation rate started to pick up, they would remove the accommodation. And then inflation would fall again, and they would become more accommodative, and then that inflation rate would increase a little bit, and then remove the accommodation. So again, the lesson learned there was don't remove your accommodation too soon, because it can put your economy back into a recession. And so those are some of the factors that this committee is weighing as they decide when to increase the interest rates. There's some information that you can also, for those of you who are interested, can also go onto the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors website to see about the economic forecast that this committee has for how economic growth will evolve, how the unemployment rate will evolve, and how the inflation rate will evolve. Right now, their forecasts are that economic growth is going to be slightly better this year than last. Last year, the rate of growth, although we don't have the final number from the Census Bureau, but the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. But thinking is that 2014, our economy grew at a rate of about 2.4%. This Federal Reserve Committee believes that in 2015, the growth rate in the economy is going to be between 2.6 and 3%. That's their central tendency, the forecast that they made public. In 2016, they see growth right around that same range, 2.5% to 3%, and then 2017, 2.3% to 2.5%. Now, one of the things that I'm very sensitive to is that the Federal Reserve started to release their economic forecast. This committee that makes monetary policy, we started to release the forecast in November of 2007. And the committee releases its forecast, economic forecast, 4 times a year. And so the good news is we've been giving the public more information about how we're thinking about how the economy will evolve. The bad news is that since 2007, since we started to release our forecast, we've been overly optimistic in the forecast. We've been wrong on the upside almost every time we've released forecasts. That with revisions, we've had to scale back those forecasts. Now, it's not just the Federal Reserve economists that have been wrong. It's been pretty much across the board. Economists were more optimistic about how the economy would evolve after the financial crisis and the economic recession, the deep recession that we were in. But that's not how the economy unfolded, and so we were wrong on, we were too optimistic on how much economic growth we would see in the economy. The unemployment rate, though, we were wrong there, but on the opposite in the opposite way. We continued to forecast that the unemployment rate would decline gradually, and we got several surprises, and we saw larger drops in the unemployment rate than we were expecting. But unfortunately, the biggest reason for those misses, for those large drops, were that more people were exiting the labor force, and so that participation rate went down, and that improved the unemployment rate outlook. And for inflation, this is another area where we missed. The committee continues to have been, again, a little too optimistic on how the inflation rate would evolve. Right now, I mentioned the committee's target for inflation is 2%, but in 2014, the inflation rate came in around 1.2%. And the committee is expecting in 2015 the inflation rate to be between 1% and 1.6%. So they're missing on their target. They don't expect to get that inflation rate up to their 2% objective until 2017. So that's some background on how the committee believes the economy will evolve. The committee, though, and I said at the start of my comments that most everyone expects this committee to raise rates in 2015. And the reason for that is again an information they gave us. In those summary for economic projections that were released in December, 15 of the 17 members of this committee said that they anticipate it will be appropriate to begin raising interest rates in 2015. Only 2 participants did not think that that would be appropriate, and they think it will be appropriate to wait until 2016 to raise rates. There was some additional information given, and that is that there is information released with the economic projections that show where the 17 people believe the federal funds rate will be at the end of 2015. And the ranges are pretty wide. There are two people who say there's not going to be any change, they're going to still be at 0. There are 4 people who believe they're going to be all the way up to 1.9%. So that's a huge increase from where they are now. And then the rest of the group is scattered somewhere in between that. So that's why I'm telling you, the Fed doesn't know itself when it plans to increase interest rates. And if you look out further, the range is even wider. In 2016, the range for where this federal funds rate, which is at 0 now, is going to be from 0.3 all the way to 0.3 to 4. And at the end of 2017, this committee's range of where this Fed funds rate is going to be is between 2% and 4.25. So again, this committee is still trying to assess what's going on in the economy and how to respond in terms of their interest rate policy. So let me conclude, and then I'll get to your questions. It's always difficult, as I said earlier, to determine the right timing for an interest rate increase. I mentioned that I supported the last interest rate increase, which was more than 9 years ago. But this time, it is going to be more challenging. The biggest reason why it's going to be more challenging is that this time the Federal Reserve can't rely on historical experience. As I mentioned earlier, we are in uncharted waters. We've not had the federal funds rate near 0 for as long as it has been there. And typically the Federal Reserve raises rates because it's concerned about inflationary pressures. Well, right now there are no inflation. The committee does not see inflationary pressures out there. In fact, inflation is very low. And so it's going to be historical for it to raise rates even though inflation is well below its expectations or below its target. Another reason why it's good, we're in uncharted waters, is I mentioned that very large balance sheet. And it's not clear that the Federal Reserve can have the same control over the Fed funds rate with this very large balance sheet. In fact, it has said that it still wants to continue to target the federal funds rate but it's going to, that federal funds rate market essentially dried up during this, this environment of very low interest rates. And so it's going to have to use other tools, and it's been testing other tools to help support this federal funds rate target. But those are, they're testing them in small quantities, and these are technical tools such as repurchase agreement, overnight repurchase agreements, interest it pays on excess reserves to the banks that are holding reserves, but those tools have been tested in small quantities, but they're going to have to be used in very large quantities to help them again manage the control of the federal funds rate. So they're going to be using, they're going to be operating in an environment where they're going to have to experiment with some new tools, which will make it more challenging. And it's going to be challenging to communicate with the public because in the past, the committee followed some policy rules. And again, I don't want to get too technical, but there's an individual, Don Taylor, who actually did analysis that showed that the Fed would raise rates based on how much of an output gap we had and how much of an inflation gap we had. And you could actually see that the Fed pretty much followed what was called this Taylor rule to set policy. Well, that Taylor rule said that the Fed should have been raising interest rates a few years ago, and obviously the Fed is not following that tool. And so the economist and market Fed watchers are having a difficult time assessing what policy tool the Fed is using. So again, it's going to be a little more challenging to communicate with the public and to explain to the public what reaction function, what policy tool the committee will be following as it starts to raise interest rates. So it's a very challenging environment, but I can assure you that the people who will be making those decisions are very competent and also make those decisions with the goal of doing the right thing for the U.S. economy. I have to tell you, and again, I've been a part of that, or I was a part of that organization for 35 years. But I can tell you that the people who participate in this monetary policy making process, are very focused on doing the right thing for the U.S. economy. They're not. The group is not politically motivated. The group is independent from Congress and the administration, and they really do make these decisions based on what's the right thing for the U.S. economy. Now they have different points of views on how the U.S. economy will evolve, and that then gives them different perspectives of when rates should be increased. But they do have the right goal and the right intentions in mind. So again, thank you for your very kind attention, and I'd be happy to answer some of your questions. Who wants to start off? Yes, in the back.
The Fed statement is obviously highly anticipated every time it comes out. How do you go about formulating a statement with 17 wide-ranging opinions? And for those who think that rates should be moving up, do they voice their opinion strongly that their voice should be heard in that statement? How do you put all that together?
That's an excellent question. I mentioned a nuance in my comments about Alan Greenspan using forward guidance. When Alan Greenspan was chair, the statement that was issued, first of all, let me just go back in history a little bit. The Federal Reserve, when it conducted its meetings prior to February of 1993, never told markets what decision it reached at the meeting. And there was a whole industry of Fed watchers, and they'd watch reserves and whether reserve balances, whether the Fed was issuing more reserves or slowing its issuance of reserves, and that's how they would determine whether the Fed had moved its target for the federal funds rate. So there's this whole industry. Back in February of 1993, the Fed had not changed its federal funds rate target for several years. And so the committee had this discussion, and the transcripts that are available, about whether just this one time, because nobody had been paying attention to the fact that they were even meeting, because everything was just so stable. So just this one time, they were going to issue a statement saying that at their meeting, the committee had reached the decision to tighten the quantity of reserves they were going to be supplying to the markets, which was the language of saying we were bringing up our target for the Fed funds rate. And they said they were just going to do that at that one meeting. Well, you know, once you start doing something, you can't stop. And so that was the first time, and the statements following those meetings for several years were just a one-line statement that said the FOMC had decided to tighten or to loosen its provisions of reserves. And then we went into this environment in 2003, 2004, where once again the markets expected us to raise rates. Alan Greenspan and the committee, and I was part of the committee then, decided no, we needed to keep rates lower for a while, and so we added a few sentences to this statement, and that was the forward guidance. But the statements when Alan Greenspan was chair were considered the chairman's statement. And so he didn't spend a lot of time asking for our input about what that statement looked like. And in fact, when Alan Greenspan was chair of the committee, he would go first on the monetary policy go-around, because you had a go-around at every meeting on how the economy is unfolding, and then there was a go-around on what appropriate monetary policy should be. Alan Greenspan went first in those go-arounds, and again, if you look at the transcripts, what followed after he went first was, I agree, Mr. Chairman, I agree, Mr. Chairman, I agree, Mr. Chairman, I agree, Mr. Chairman, around the table. Ben Bernanke joins the Fed and becomes chair, and he makes many changes to how we operated, and one of the changes he made was that statement that is issued following the meetings now became a committee statement. Well, to your point, when 17 people are trying to craft a statement, it can get pretty unwieldy. And there were some meetings where it did. I mean, we would spend half hour debating whether we should use will or might. I mean, it was just, or may or might. I mean, it started to get a little bit challenging. So what started to happen is that Ben would send us various drafts of the statement prior to the meeting. And then he would ask for our input, and then he would redraft it several times. And then at the meeting, there was still a lot of editing that went on. But yes, the committee actually uses a process. And again, some of the nuances and some of the slight changes that would be made to accommodate someone so that he or she wouldn't dissent, I mean, a lot of that went on. The other change Ben made was during the policy go-round, he went last. He would listen to each of the committee members and then present what he heard from the committee as to the approach that we should take in the policy decision. And Janet Yellen has continued to use that approach of going last. So it is. So yes. So there are various pieces and parts, moving pieces and parts, and that changing and working on that language of that statement became an important part of preparing for the meeting, and also an important part. A lot of time is spent on making sure that language is appropriate. The other thing Ben introduced, because again, it's hard to put all of that information, that thinking on it in a statement, even though that statement has grown from one sentence to 1.5 pages now. It's much longer. But the other thing that Ben introduced was the press conferences following for the meetings, and that began, I think, back in 2012, the very first, 2012 or 2013. I'm getting my dates wrong, but it was Ben who said, we need to communicate more, and I will do a press conference following the meetings where we share our economic projections. And so again, it was Ben wanting to be as transparent as can be and share more information with the public. Yes.
A lot of uncertainty with the Greek elections on what's going to happen with the Eurozone. How much attention does the Fed pay to that?
The Fed pays attention to what's happening in international markets, but the attention goes from understanding what's happening and how it will impact the U.S. economy, because the mandate of the Fed is to have maximum employment and stable prices in the U.S. economy. And there have been a lot of critics that say that the policy, that this low interest rate policy that we have been operating was detrimental to, well, it was helpful. It moved a lot of capital, a lot of investments into countries where interest rates were higher, especially the underdeveloped countries. And now, with the anticipation that our interest rates are going to rise again, those countries are concerned that capital is going to flow out of their countries back into the U.S. And they've been very vocal about the fact that the Fed has to be sensitive to the impact that these policies are having on all of these countries. But the reality is, the Fed has responsibility for the U.S. economy, and the Fed doesn't have a lot of tools. I mean, trying to use the Fed funds rate target, it's a very blunt tool, and it can't micromanage the impact. I mean, it's very difficult to micromanage our own economy, let alone take into consideration what's happening around the world. The Fed had, right now, your comment about the euro, the European Central Bank has recently announced that it's going to undertake quantitative easing. Most will say that they waited too long, that if they had been as aggressive in their monetary policy as the Fed had been, Europe would not be going back into a recession. Right now, many of the countries within Europe are back in a recession, and many people blame the European Central Bank. But the European Central Bank is very different, a very different animal. They have a responsibility. It is, these countries that have come together, and they have responsibility for the monetary policy of those countries, but not the fiscal policies. And I've commented on how difficult it is to get 17 people that share the same objectives and share the same information to agree on policy. Can you imagine what it's like to get these different countries? And one of the reasons, and they all have the same vote right now, they're trying to set up a model where they're going to rotate some of their voting, but the head of the German central bank has the same vote as the head of the Greek central bank, and that participates in this monetary policy. Well, Germany doesn't want accommodative monetary policy, and the Greeks and the Italians and some of the others do. And so they've not been able to be as aggressive and as quick to respond to what was happening in their economy as we were in the United States. And it's showing up now in their economic activity. David, you had your hand up.
It was sort of a follow-up to your first answer. Does it matter who's the chair of the Federal Reserve? Alan Greenspan was kind of a personality in Washington, and Ben Bernanke made changes you were just talking about. I guess I'm curious if you have an opinion about the unconventional choice that President Obama made when he selected Janet Yellen, and what she is like, and does she have a different impact on the work of the Fed than Bernanke or Greenspan?
I have to think about how to answer, Dave, your question about does it matter, because they've been very different personalities, but one of the things that's important is that the people sitting around the table have confidence and respect for the chair. And I can tell you that everyone that sat around that table had respect and confidence in Ben Bernanke. There were differences of opinion, and some people were vocal about those differences. But respecting his knowledge and his motives, etc. The respect was there. And that is also true of Janet Yellen. The people that sit around that table respect her experience, her knowledge, her ability to lead, her ability to lead this committee down the path of appropriate monetary policy. And I also watched Janet change, though, from when she was a member of the committee to becoming chair. When she was a member of the committee and not chair, you knew exactly what perspective she had, and you could see it in her body language. If she agreed with you, you'd be, and when you were saying something at the table, she'd be doing this. If she disagreed with you, you'd see her kind of doing this. And so you knew exactly, but she was a member bringing her perspective to the table. Her first meeting as chair, I didn't see any body language. And I said something to her after the meeting, and she said, you know, Sandy, I understood that as I became chair, I couldn't bring my perspective to the table. I had to listen to the committee members' perspective and bring and figure out how to bring a consensus. And so I think she's been a great chair also. But you know, it's a very, again, it's a challenging time. And I do think that, I was asked yesterday at a speech I gave in New York, how historians will write history about Ben Bernanke. And you know, it's going to be too soon because we're not done. We don't know yet how the story of this unconventional policy tools and very aggressive accommodative monetary policy is going to end, because this committee still has to normalize. But I do think that because of the type of individual Ben Bernanke is, history will know that he did, again, what he thought was best for our country. And he did not, you know, obviously a person that's got that kind of a position has to have some ego, but he is a very humble person and really worked and was a very wonderful public servant. Yes, in the back?
So I have two questions. The first one is when the mission is maximum employment. When the tool, the inverse of that changes because of underemployment and reduced participation, what does the Fed do in terms of adjusting that tool and then communicating that to the community that's reacting to whatever that tool, whatever that statement is? And my second one is, how does an environment where we have $18 trillion in debt change the thought process relative to interest rates, when that's going to have some impact as well, instead of just on what our domestic economy is?
So the issue around maximum employment, the Federal Reserve does have what's called the dual mandate. It was given to the Fed by Congress. And the dual mandate is that the committee will conduct monetary policy to promote maximum employment and stable prices. They did not give the committee numerical objectives for maximum employment and stable prices. And in 2011, the committee issued a statement, and it's updated every year, and again, you can see it on the website, that said that put for the first time a numerical objective for stable prices, and that's when the committee adopted its 2% objective for inflation. And the reason the committee, and again I was a member of, so I supported this statement, is that we adopted this 2% objective, is that the monetary policy is responsible for the long-term inflation rate of the U.S. economy. So we, through policy, can affect the longer-term inflation rate. You know, in the short term, there are lots of factors that are going to affect inflation. Right now, the lower oil prices is putting downward pressure on inflation rates. Lower import prices is pushing downward pressure. But over the longer term, it's really the amount of money and credit that the Federal Reserve puts into the economy that affects prices in general, the overall general level of prices. And so the committee, since the committee through monetary policy can affect long-term inflation rate, they felt comfortable putting a number on it. With maximum employment, the committee said there are many factors that determine maximum employment. And monetary policy is just one, and in fact not the most important. Demographics affect the unemployment rate or maximum employment. Technology affects it. Labor regulations and laws affect the maximum employment. And so rather than put a number around it, they said that they actually, you could look at what the committee's projections are for the longer run on the unemployment rate. And right now, they say in the longer run, which is a definition of what they think the current economy can support in terms of maximum employment, is 5.2 to 5.5%. So we're getting close with our 5.7% unemployment rate to where this committee thinks we're at maximum employment. But there are many issues. It's not just that one number that they're looking at. To your point, the participation rate has been low, and that's helped bring the unemployment rate down. However, in this last jobs report, for the first time, we're starting to see an uptick in the participation rate. In fact, 777,000 people joined the labor force in the month of January because they're more confident that they can get a job. That pushed the unemployment rate up a little bit from 5.6 to 5.7. But yet there were more than 257,000 jobs created in January, but there were 777,000 people who also joined the labor force. So the labor markets are something that the committee spends a lot of time trying to assess. There are still many people that are unemployed that want to be employed. There are still too many people that have part-time jobs that want full-time jobs. So that's keeping downward pressure on wages, and that can give that gives the committee confidence that there isn't going to be inflationary pressures building. On the issue around the very challenging fiscal environment we have, the committee doesn't conduct policy or try to target interest rates based on the debt level that the U.S. economy has. Right now, it's been much less expensive for the government to issue debt. They're issuing, when they issue 10-year Treasury securities right now, they're paying less than 2% interest on those. But the decision on how much debt to put out there is not, is not controlled by the Fed. The Fed has said on many, many occasions that we need to pay more attention to the rising debt levels that we have in this country, the fiscal deficits that we have. If we don't make changes to the entitlement programs, the outcomes in the future are going to be disastrous. If we don't change the entitlement programs, in 30 years, every penny that the federal government takes in tax revenue is going to be needed to fund just 3 programs: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There's going to be no money left for anything else: education, defense, interest on the debt. So we've got to change. We've got to change that. Those long-term liabilities are looming, and something has to be done. But the Fed, doesn't set interest rates thinking that it's going to be easier for the federal government to fund that debt. That does not enter the conversation and discussion at all. Well, thank you again for your kind invitation, and again for your support of the Akron Community Foundation. Thank you.